Without a doubt, he was one of the best rock climbers of his generation. The way that he scaled walls of rock and ice and snow was seen as almost an art form, taking shape by how he placed his hands, where he placed his feet, and how he lived his life with dedication to the ascent. As with many of the greatest, it is hard to encapsulate everything that they've accomplished into a single story, a quick description that can be fully digested in a few sentences. These people, as well as everyone, require a deeper discussion, a moment where you sit down, turn off your devices, and really listen with your heart. Upon request, today we deliver an ode to Marc-Andre Leclerc, and we will not glance over his formidable partner, Ryan Johnson. Welcome back to Tragedy with a View. I am your host, Kayla, and this is another free solo episode. Next week, we'll be back with someone. If you are listening to this on YouTube, or let me rephrase that. If you are watching this on YouTube, hi, thank you for being here. I'm trying something new, undecided on if this is actually going to be something that I continue or not, but there is a video recording of this episode on YouTube. Please go like it, subscribe, comment, tell me what you think. Again, I don't know that this is going to be something that I continue with long term. It depends kind of how long it takes for me to figure out the editing for video recording, but giving it a try. So before we really get into this episode, I wanted to take a minute to comment that I have been watching The Monsters on Netflix. And if you have watched it, or if you've watched part of it, I want to know your thoughts. I want to know what you're thinking with the show, because I know that there's inaccuracies and some of them are a little uncomfortable, cringe-ish. And I'm having a really hard time like moving forward with the show. So I'm curious if you guys are getting that feeling too, or if my sinister sensor is just like diminished or something. I don't know. Tell me what you think. Moving on, as implied in the intro, this is a requested story that one of my listeners reached out and asked that we talk about Marc-Andre Leclerc specifically. And I also wanted to include in here that a lot of the research that I've looked into is really focused on Marc, and there seems to be less information out there about Ryan and his climbing. And so I really wanted to take a little bit of time and talk about Ryan in this episode too, and the legacy in which he is leaving. And so we're going to kind of do things a little bit differently this time. Normally I talk about the people prior to telling the actual story. I kind of introduce them and tell you about them. We're going to do that opposite this time because this is a more widely known story. So I'm going to tell you the story, and then we're going to talk about Ryan and then Marc. As many of us know, Ryan and Marc went to climb the Mendenhall Towers that are made up of 7 peaks that run east to west about 12 miles north of Juneau, Alaska. The 7 peaks are named from west to east are the West Tower, Second Tower, also known as Midget, Main Tower, 4th Tower, 5th Tower, 6th Tower, and 7th Tower. The Main Tower is the tallest of the 7 and rises 6,910 feet or 2,106 kilometers into the air. The north face takes up about 2,500 feet of that elevation, or 762 meters. And until 2018, it was unclimbable. This face by itself, for anyone who needs a size comparison, is taller than Yosemite's Half Dome. There are several routes to be able to climb the towers, some of the routes being as short as 500 feet, and the tallest being 2,500 feet, or 152 to 762 meters. And these are specific routes within the climb to get to the summit. So there's maybe a route towards the bottom and there's another route towards the top that you can kind of like combine to get up to the summit versus, instead of going left, you could go right and take a different route. The south face of the towers are significantly less technical and shorter than the north side of the mountains. To get to the towers, you can hike to the glacier and start there, or charter a helicopter and take you directly to the glacier. To hike, it is expected to take a day or two, whereas flying will take about a half hour. The towers are home to only 2 known fatalities, those of course being Marc-Andre Leclerc and Ryan Johnson. At 25, Marc had made some really epic climbs that others might consider bold and maybe even reckless, but this is what made him the athlete and therefore the person that he was. Prior to 2018, Ryan had what looked like a reckless obsession with the Mendenhall Towers. Being so close to where he grew up, when Ryan found a natural talent in climbing, he honed that talent with practice and gained skill and knowledge and confidence. His obsession became a goal when he started climbing the Mendenhall Towers, creating numerous routes, and then his focus narrowed on the unclimbed north face of the main tower. In 2015, he set out to attempt the north face, but after making it just past the halfway point and finding the ice dangerously thin, he decided to bail. This would be the same route that he and Marc would climb again 3 years later. The climb, he explained, wasn't really technical. There was just no way to protect yourself or your partner in the event of a fall. The granite they would climb was extremely fragile, and the open face meant that there was little to stop a fall. In short, even if climbed with a partner, they would need to treat the climb as if they were free climbing the face solo. And so, in January of 2018, Ryan reached out to Marc to see if he wanted to climb the north face of the main tower with him. With Marc's skill set and desire to climb, Marc was the clear choice in a climbing partner when developing a new route. On Saturday, March 3rd, 2018, Marc and his girlfriend Brett kissed goodbye as Marc was heading to Alaska and Brett was heading toward warmer weather in Tasmania. They were both chasing different climbs. Marc was flying to meet 34-year-old Ryan Johnson, who had invited him to climb the Mendenhall Towers. With the weather looking good, Marc decided to take Ryan up on his offer. On March 4th, a Sunday, Marc and Ryan boarded a chopper from Coastal Helicopters and flew to the Mendenhall Glacier, which was just north of the towers. Once they landed, they checked the weather and saw that while the sun was shining and the snow seemed stable, and it was a beautiful day in that moment, there was a high-pressure system on its way. This doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it is a sign of stable weather and that it was predicted to last about 3 days. After this, the weather looked a little sketchy. About a half a mile from the very base of the tower, Ryan and Marc left some gear, including skis that they wouldn't need until they were on their way home. The plan was simple. They would shimmy up the north face, come to the summit, then go along the ridge until they found a good descent route to the east. Then pick up their gear and ski the 10 miles back to Juneau by Wednesday, March 7th. Upon arriving, they immediately set to work on the climb. While the climb wasn't as challenging as either of them had experienced in the past, the sun did set at 5:35 p.m., so Marc and Ryan tied in and slept on the face of the main tower. At daybreak, Marc and Ryan started to climb to the narrow summit of Mendenhall's main tower, and at 10:30 a.m. on March 5th, 2018, they made it to the summit, successfully laying a new route through the north face. The climb had been as smooth and undramatic as anyone could hope for. The summit was only the size of a dinner table, but gave them the space to stop and take a breath and take in the enormity of what they'd just accomplished. Both men had set numerous routes on different mountains, but for Ryan, this one was incredibly special. He achieved his goal. They had incredible weather. He was a prodigy of a climber and felt on top of the world. Marc texted Brett saying that he was at the summit, it was an incredible climb, and sent her photos while also posting to Instagram. Ryan, next to him, stood and made a slow circle with his arm outstretched. He was taking a video that he would send to his wife. Their view was perfect. There wasn't a single cloud in the sky, and there was nothing but more gigantic peaks of Alaskan mountains in their view. This feeling of accomplishment, gratitude, and bliss would be short-lived. They were expected to make it back to their base camp by March 7th, but after family and friends didn't hear from either Mark or Ryan, Brett called the Juneau Mountain Rescue to see if they had any information that they could give. And they did. They had spoke to Ryan shortly before he went on the climb, and Ryan gave them the itinerary detailing that they wouldn't be back to their camp until late on Wednesday, March 7th, or this day that Brett was calling them. Remember, they have cell phone reception in certain areas, so there is potential that if these men got into trouble, one of them would be able to call for help. With this information, JMR, or Juneau Mountain Rescue, and Brett discussed options and agreed that if they didn't hear from the men the next day, a search team would be deployed to see if they could locate Mark and Ryan's skis. If they found the skis, this would indicate that Mark and Ryan were somewhere on the mountain still, or if they didn't find the skis, then Mark and Ryan had made it off of the mountain. If nothing else, this would indicate where to search next. Unfortunately, the next day, with still no word from either Ryan or Mark, a search team set out and found the skis exactly where the pair had left them. A Sitka-based Coast Guard helicopter would be flying over the towers and using infrared camera technology to try to find signs of body heat and therefore Mark and Ryan's location. Just a real quick side note, this Coast Guard rescue team that departed from Sitka is the same base location that we talked about in a couple of water rescues in episode 15 and then also episode 46. This initial search produced negative results, meaning that they didn't find any body heat using the infrared camera. Therefore, they had no idea where Mark or Ryan could be. With this information, they talked to Brett again, and this time she panicked and thought that they were done searching and that's all that they were going to do. So she started to work on creating her own search team and booked a flight to Juneau. When she got there on March 10th, she learned that this wasn't the case at all. The Coast Guard had continued to search for signs of Mark and Ryan, but due to poor weather conditions, the search had to be postponed for 4 days. But friends and family, climbing partners, and athlete managers of both Ryan and Mark were all showing up in Juneau, all trying to figure out how they could help. To try to put together a timeline, search and rescue asked for times that people had received calls or text from Mark or Ryan, and the best timeline that they could start with was from when Mark had texted Brett saying that he was at the summit at 10:26 a.m. Over an hour later, he had texted his mother, but everyone knew that Mark and Ryan wouldn't have stayed on the summit this long. From this information, they were able to put together that if Ryan and Mark started to go down the same way that they came up, they would have lost cell phone service immediately, indicating that they found a different route down the mountain. As it happens, often with search and rescue, there was a lot of urgency coupled with the facts that sometimes you have to sit and wait for the right conditions. So that's what happened here. Everyone came together. They created a timeline. They used maps for references, created a plan, and then had to sit and wait as a storm blew through the area. Finally, on March 13th, search and rescue was given the go-ahead to start searching again. More than 4 feet of snow had fallen in the past week, so everyone was ready to get moving and find these guys. At the summit, a Black Hawk helicopter hovered enough for one of the members to notice a pair of footprints. Then they found a second set. The prints were nearly filled with snow and almost impossible to see. They got lucky though, and were able to follow the shallow but distinct footfall pattern as they made their way along the ridge. They followed the prints, which would travel along the ridge, heading east toward the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th towers. So JMR kind of had to assume that these prints belonged to Mark and Ryan. They hadn't received word of anyone else who was missing, and they also didn't know of anyone else who might have been climbing. Still, there was a chance that these footprints belonged to a different set of climbers who potentially safely got off the mountain and returned home. As they followed the ridge and approached the convergence of the 4th tower and the main tower, the footprints suddenly ended where a gully began. This gully would lead 1,000 feet or 305 meters down from the ridge to a bergschrund crevasse, which is where a crevasse is formed at the base of a mountain where like a glacier meets up with the base of that rock. And then as the glacier is shifting and pulling away from the rocky base, it creates this crack. And that's what forms the crevasse. At the top of the gully, so at the very top where the 4th tower and main tower met together, there was a small piece of black and white paracord that was just dangling. Rescue groups felt confident at this point that they had found Mark and Ryan's descent route. They just needed to locate the men. The Black Hawk helicopter that they were in was a great option for doing initial information collecting, but to follow the gully down and to search closer to the mountain, they would need something different. Switching to an A-Star helicopter, which is a smaller and more agile craft, they were able to get much closer. This helicopter had a RICO detector on board, which would allow members of the flight team to pick up signals from electronics or metal, such as cell phone. As they searched, they would report to a second helicopter that was hovering nearby with Brett and Sam Johnson, Ryan's best friend, inside. As the A-Star approached the bergschrund crevasse, a section of orange rope could be seen. It was stretched tight as if anchored on each end. 15 feet beneath the rope, the RECO detector lit up, letting them know that 2 individuals were buried in the snow. No one needed confirmation. Everyone knew that if they followed the rope, they would find Mark at one end and Ryan on the other. Initially, Brett and Sam wanted to rappel the same descent to find their loved ones, but after speaking with Search and Rescue, it was decided that this was just too dangerous. The discovery is likely the result of an avalanche or potentially collapsing snow, a cornice, or collapsing ice and rock. Of course, you can never rule out human error where one made a mistake in their anchor system, or in a completely different example, someone failed to put a knot in the bottom of their rope to prevent them from going right off the end. But while having rappelling fatalities is a really common occurrence, having 2 perish at the same time is extremely rare. Due to this, combined with the fact that both men are buried in debris, everyone feels safe assuming that an avalanche, rockfall, or some sort of collapse of natural occurrence had ripped the men from where they stood. For months after, there were small efforts to recover Mark and Ryan from their resting place, each time finding that the location of their bodies would require passing treacherous terrain, and no matter what direction they tried to take, it was deemed too dangerous not only to reach the men, but to then also remove them. From the sounds of it, Mark and Ryan wouldn't have wanted to leave the mountains anyways. The efforts made to find Mark and Ryan were significantly larger than I can explain. Juneau Mountain Rescue, while leading the search, had assistance from the U.S. Coast Guard, Alaska State Troopers, Alaska Army National Guard, Alaska Incident Management Team, Southeast Alaska Dog Organized for Ground Search, Coastal Helicopters, North Star Trekking, and Alaska Search and Rescue Dogs. As we can already figure, Ryan had a wild streak, and before he became a father, he could be found chain smoking cigarettes while sitting in a tent. He was born in Juneau and loved his hometown and was particularly drawn to the Mendenhall Towers. Ryan grew up in Juneau, meaning that he explored and became familiar with these towers and frequently visited them for climbing, hiking, and skiing activities, both alone and with his friends. Early in his adolescence and adulthood, Ryan loved to explore and sought out adventure every chance he could. Once graduating from high school, he fed into that desire and climbed in Yosemite, the Canadian Rockies, the Cascade Mountains, the southwestern deserts of the United States, and going abroad to the Himalayas, Nepal, Tibet, Kyrgyzstan, and of course, he climbed all over Alaska. In 2005, he and his climbing partner, Stefan Ritchie, climbed the Kasson Ridge on Denali, which is 9,000 feet or 2,745 meters. To make that more digestible, that's 1.75 or 2.8 kilometers of vertical climbing. Ryan was the type of person to always cheer others on and never paid attention to any routes that he made first ascents on. He was happy and vibrant and lived life as fast as he could. But he also had a head on his shoulders. After graduation from the University of Montana, he returned to Juneau and really began to make a name for himself in the local climbing community. Ryan was also very active in the mountaineering activities and assisted 4 Juneau Mountain Rescue members out of a sticky situation when they got stuck on a ridge during a storm in 2015. Also in 2015, when Ryan's son Milo was born, Ryan had a bit of a rebirth too. He loved being a father and started really taking a look at his life and how what he did impacted his son. He aimed to be someone his son could look up to learn from, and as many parents can relate, be someone to show their kid the way by example, not just using words. In other words, he tried to live out loud and show his son that anything was possible rather than just telling him, "Oh, you could be president one day." With Milo, though, Ryan settled down, calculated risk more often, and took on work selling packages to tourists on Princess Cruise Lines. One day, while climbing on Denali, he had an idea that began to take shape, and he decided to open Tongass CrossFit. Ryan is said to be one of the best climbers in Alaska and absolutely among the best in North America. Ryan was the one who set many of the routes up the Mendenhall Towers, and he had already been to the summit of the main tower by the South Buttress direct route. In February of 2018, Ryan and his best friend Sam had won the American Alpine Club Cutting Edge Award. This award is a grant that helps to fund expeditions. Depending on the cost of the expedition and how much money is available will determine how much someone receives with this award. Usually it's between $5,000 and $15,000. This grant is to help support small teams who are chasing big goals, like those of difficult routes, first ascents, and the like. The grant is sponsored by Black Diamond Equipment. Marc-Andre Leclerc was born on October 10th, 1992, in Nanaimo, British Columbia in Canada. His mother's name is Michelle and his father's name is Sarge. Mark had 2 sisters, Bridget Ann, who was older, and Kellen, who was younger. While Mark didn't start climbing until years later, at 4 years old, he could rattle off how tall the formidable mountains were, including Everest, and he could name the adventures of Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. Hillary being a mountaineer, if you don't know the name, look it up, and Norgay was his Sherpa, being known for the first to reach the summit of Everest. Mark's father was an active outdoorsman and took Mark on trips to go camping and hiking, and Mark was thrilled to be out there. Mark was introduced to climbing at 8 years old when his grandfather gifted him a book called Quest for Adventure. But Mark didn't start climbing until the following year when he was 9, and he very quickly became known for his solo climbs on rock and ice and the combination of the two. The first experience that Mark had with climbing was at a shopping mall where they had a indoor climbing gym, but he would pretty quickly join a gym called Project Climbing. It seemed that Mark's energy was able to be channeled when he climbed, and it was the only place that he settled down. Things didn't really start to take off until 2005 when his family moved to Agassiz, which is near the Cascade Range in Canada, and it is here that Mark began teaching himself how to rock climb. To get to the climbing locations, he was often riding his bike out to the area called Harrison Buffs in order to climb, and he would often spend the night here by himself so that way he could have more climbing time. Here, Mark joined the British Columbia Mountaineering Club and started competing in rock climbing. He very quickly was winning his age group competitions and then would go on to win the Canadian Nationals. In these, Mark was usually competing against boys who were older than him by not just like a year, like 3 or 4 years older than him. But he also realized that competing wasn't something he enjoyed, and he asked to be pulled from the team when he was 14 years old. To save money to be able to afford old and used rock and ice climbing gear, Mark began to work in construction with his father, and the gear that he bought was really old. Like, some of these items were 60 years old, but Mark would use and learn with these items. By the time he was coming out of high school, he had climbed multiple pitches and learned to ice climb, getting places by hitchhiking and then spending much of his time climbing alone really gave Mark the lessons in problem solving that would take him great places. To celebrate, in a way, his own graduation in 2009, he soloed the 6,903 foot or 2,104 meter north face of Cheam Peak. When he wasn't in the mountains climbing or working, Mark was often found practicing lying and building anchors while at home or outside practicing his ice climbing by climbing up telephone poles. In 2012, Mark met Brett Harrington, and they became a popular duo in the climbing community. Despite his clear adoration with Brett, Mark still felt most at home on a mountain, but Brett, she echoed this feeling. In 2013, he made the first free ascent of the Temptation of St. Anthony, located in Squamish, British Columbia in Canada. Also in 2013, Mark broke Alex Honnold's time to climb up the Grand Wall of Stowamus Chief, which is a granite dome in Squamish that is 2,300 feet or 700 meters in elevation. The Grand Wall is just, again, a section of this climb. And in case you don't know, Alex Honnold is arguably one of the best climbers of our lifetime. And reporters have mentioned that when it comes to Alex, that he does so many incredible things, they basically have to pick and choose what they report on because otherwise it's just too much. And I need to say that again. Alex Honnold sets so many records that the media can't keep up. Keep that in mind. So the Grand Wall is about 1,000 feet or 308 meters, and Alex Honnold climbed this route, setting a speed record of 59 minutes in 2011. When Mark came to the Grand Wall in 2013, the idea of beating Alex's time wasn't really on his mind. He knew of it, but it was not something that he was setting out to beat. It wasn't until later in the section of the climb that he realized he could at least match the record. The climb to that point had gone really smooth, so Marc decided to challenge himself and ended up completing the time in 57 minutes, shaving off 2 minutes from Alex's time. So, of course, theoretically speaking, and this is my opinion as well, ego and success go hand in hand. It is really hard to become just this insanely great person without having some sort of ego and without having some sort of superiority complex. Like, you have to believe that you're capable of more than the average human in order to accomplish more than the average human. And how you let that complex and how you let that ego control your life or not control your life is, where problems may or may not arise. Coming back to Alex heard about Marc breaking his record. And as I mentioned, ego and success go hand in hand. Alex heard about this and had a moment where he was like, no, that record is mine. So Alex goes back and he sets himself into a class all his own and climbs the same route in 38 minutes. So Marc is a very good climber, right? He's one of the best. But Alex was also willing to show this younger guy that, he still had work to do. Like, he might be good, but he needs to challenge himself to keep up. The thing with Marc, though, was that he didn't really care. He wanted to climb and he wanted to be in the mountains because he loved it and he enjoyed it, not because he was trying to set records. However, set records he does. In 2014, Marc free solo climbed the Trimble Link up of East Pillar Direct of Mount Slessy in Cascade Ridge. This took him 12 hours and 4 minutes, and Marc still holds the fastest known time today, 10 years later. Also, if you don't know what free soloing is, it's where you're climbing without ropes or protective gear, so don't fall. On February 21st, 2015, Marc had gone to Argentine Patagonia and completed his first solo ascent of the corkscrew on Cerro Torre. This route is known to be one of the hardest routes to solo climb, and that's not even considering that this was only his 7th solo climb ever. While he was here, he also made the first ascent up the Torre Traverse. The corkscrew route is 4,000 feet or 1,220 meters of exposed ice and rock. Later that same year, Marc would complete the second known free solo ascent of Tomahawk on Aguja Standhart in Patagonia. He then concluded this monstrous climbing year by completing a free ascent of the Muir Wall on El Capitan in Yosemite National Park. In 2016, Marc moved into his mother's attic when the media got word of him and started reaching out to see about interviews. And eventually somebody would reach out about turning his story into what would become the Netflix show or the Netflix documentary, The Alpinist. Marc didn't seem to care about what the media wanted from him and was more glad to have someone there to belay him while he climbed. This way, he made the first ascent up the northeast face of Mount Tuzo in the Canadian Rockies. In 2016, he also made the first solo winter ascent of the 12,972 foot or 3,954 meter Emperor face on Mount Robson in Canada. Here, Marc got a huge lesson in problem solving when he was forced to stay the night at the summit due to poor weather moving in. But then he also spilled water on himself while he was trying to boil some snow. His headlamp batteries died, and then he dropped his lighter and couldn't find it, meaning that he had no way to melt snow for water or heat up his freeze-dried food. Brett and Mark established a new climb called the Hidden Dragon on the Chinese Puzzle Wall. Despite its name, the Chinese Puzzle Wall is on the west side of Illusion Peak, located in the North Cascade of British Columbia. Then in 2017, Mark free soloed Ha Ling Peak on Mount Lawrence Grossi, where he combined 3 routes rated 5.7 or higher, and then he made the first free solo attempt of Rim Wall and Echo Canyons in the Canadian Rockies. 5.7, by the way, is part of the rock climbing scale, and it's usually like doable, but if you're like a real beginner, it's not really that doable. In 2018, Mark climbed Mount Solace in the Cascade Range, again, this time nabbing the first free solo in winter and also claiming the second ever winter ascent. Mark would then go on to the Mendenhall Towers, where we already know he died on March 5th, 2018. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening, or if you're on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. Again, please let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear them. You can put them in the comments, reach out to me on social media or email. Glad to have you. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week. What is life without close calls with disaster? Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow the podcast to be the first to hear the now weekly episodes. Join our subscription on Patreon, Apple, or Spotify today and immerse yourself in the haunting beauty of the great outdoors. For around $4 a month, you'll get exclusive access to the first episode of each month and early access to all other episodes, showcasing the morbid and mysterious side of nature. Please reach out with story requests, and if you have your own story, please email tragedywithaview@gmail.com for a chance to have your story featured on a later episode. Again, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.